15 May 1901. I visited the camp at the Springfontein railway station in the southern Free State. What I was about to witness here haunts me until this day. The mother sat on a little trunk with a sick child across her knee. She had nothing to give it, and the child was sinking fast. Her plea for medicine to the camp superintendent fell on deaf ears. There was nothing to be done, and we watched the child draw its last breath in reverent silence. A friend standing behind the mother cried and called upon heaven to witness this tragedy. The mother neither moved nor wept for her only child. Dry-eyed, but deathly white, she sat there motionless, looking not at the child, but far, far away into the depths of grief.
According to Emily Hobhouse, no other scene that she had witnessed in South Africa would depict with the same intensity the hopelessness of women and the vulnerability of children during the Anglo-Boer War. This eyewitness account eventually formed the inspiration for the sculpting of a group of figures that would form the striking and emotive focal point of the National Women's Memorial in Bloemfontein, South Africa.
Towards the end of the 1800s, there had been an affluent Afrikaner middle class in both the Boer republics of the Orange Free State and Transvaal, living in cities, towns and rural areas where the agricultural sector was thriving. But all of this changed dramatically when the Anglo-Boer War broke out in 1899 between Britain and these two republics. This war, that continued until 1902, and especially the scorched earth tactics of the British military, not only destroyed a way of living, but also communities, family structures, the economy, infrastructure and farming sector to a large extent.
But even worse was the death of about 27,000 Afrikaner women and children in concentration or internment camps.
At 10, the guard marches up and down between the hundreds of tents and shouts, "Lights out!" As the night progresses, here and there a light begins to shine dimly in some of the tents. Mothers sheltering the candles with pieces of clothing in the hope that the guard would not see it. A child shouldn't die in darkness. The one mother asks, "Where is God?" The other thanks him for his presence. The rest of us cry with him in silence, thinking about the sacrifices we have already made and those we still face.
The effect of this tragedy on the Afrikaner and South Africa was enormous. It also denied a generation of children their right to an innocent upbringing.
Directly after the war, President M.T. Steyn, former president of the Orange Free State Republic, had to depart for Europe to receive treatment for a medical condition he developed while being with the burghers in the veldt.
Although still in poor health, the former president returned in March 1905 to his farm Onserist, just outside Bloemfontein. Being back on Free State soil rekindled an ideal of his that had originated during the war: to honor the women and children who suffered and died during the hostilities.
Here, at the Green Lodge in Bloemfontein, he initiated a meeting with friends and confidants in July 1906 to discuss his ideal.
Thereafter, it was decided to convene a national conference in Bloemfontein.
Delegates of the Dutch churches and Afrikaans political parties from all over South Africa were invited.
Here, in the old Gedenksaal of the Dutch Reformed Church, where a vehicle dealership is housed today, Steyn chaired this conference in 1907.
Some of the delegates attending the conference thought that a school or a hospital would be a fitting memorial for those who had died in the camps.
However, Steyn convinced the majority of the delegates to think differently.
The time has now come to erect a monument on South African soil. A monument commemorating the women and children who died in the recent war, or has suffered bitterly in or outside the camps. A stately monument that expresses both our sorrow and our admiration for our departed loved ones.
A working committee was formed to find a suitable place for such a monument and to raise £10,000 for the building thereof. Collection lists were distributed shortly after the conference. It became evident very soon that this monument would not be erected from the wealth of the rich, but from the poverty of the poor.
The Afrikaner experienced immense poverty after the war. They contributed in shillings and pennies. The monument became known as the 2 and 6 monument. 2 shillings and 6 pennies was enough for a meal for a day.
In the meantime, Steyn and the committee narrowed possible locations for the building of the monument down to Kroonstad and Bloemfontein.
Designs for the monument were invited by the Commission, and a prize money of £100 were made available for the best design. Designed by the sculptor Anton van Wouw and the architect Frans Soff from Pretoria, was approved by the Commission in Bloemfontein in July 1911.
The original version of this monument comprised a commemoration needle of 36.5 meters, symbolizing eternal hope, as well as 2 side panels, a circular wall, and a group of statues consisting of a woman with 2 children at her feet. Some prominent Afrikaner politicians, such as Louis Botha and Jan Smuts, had been against the erection of the monument because they were of the opinion that it was bound to stir emotions that would deepen the rift between the Afrikaners and English-speaking South Africans even further. Here, where the town hall of Bloemfontein used to be, the local city council decided to offer a location of about 20 hectares for the erection of the monument. The offer was gladly accepted by the working committee. Meanwhile, Anton van Wouw had left for the studio of Canova in Italy, where he started work on clay models of the statues and images on the side panels. During his stay, Emily Hobhouse visited him on several occasions. She shared with him her experience in Springfontein, and resultantly, van Wouw decided to change the original design to depict this incident. However, in doing so, he invited the oversight of a hard taskmaster.
Dear Mrs. Steyn, Mr. van Wouw sent for me this week to come and criticize the clay model. It is certainly an improvement on the model I saw a few months ago. Unfortunately, the mother seated with a child on her knee is still soulless and expresses nothing, and the child is comfortably asleep and neither sick nor dead in appearance. Hence the work in its present stage is meaningless. Mr. van Wouw accepted my suggestions gratefully. However, I shall do my utmost to keep him up to the pitch and not let him be satisfied too easily. Yours sincerely, Emily.
Her interference eventually came to fruition when van Wouw finally delivered what is generally known as one of his most emotive and best works of sculpture. Some critics see resemblances between van Wouw's sculpture and Michelangelo's Pieta. Others also argue that Soff's adapted design of the memorial shows similarities to the outlay of the St. Peter's Church in Rome. The depiction on one of the side panels of the monument was based on a photograph of a family being evicted from their farm during the implementation of scorched earth tactics. In the original depiction on the other panel, a woman with a dying child on her lap can be seen. But once Van Vo decided to make Hobhous's eyewitness account of what she saw at Springfontein, the theme of the group of statues, the woman with a dying child in the original panel depiction, was replaced by 2 children. After 2 years of uninterrupted work, Van Vo shipped the completed statues and side panels off to Cape Town, from where it was sent by train to Bloemfontein. The firm Medden and Leham of Bloemfontein was contracted to build the monument. Sandstone blocks from Kroonstad were used in the building process. After the gigantic construction of the needle with its tip of bronze had been completed, the group of statues and side panels were put in place and covered with canvas. The inauguration of the memorial was planned for the 16th of December 1913. Hobhouse was invited to do the unveiling of the group of statues. Disappointingly, ill health prevented her from attending the event. An organizing committee drew up a program and implemented strict rules and procedures in overseeing the erection of a large number of tents near the monument to accommodate visitors. The program leading up to the 16th of December included many activities, such as the performing of melodramas depicting aspects of the Anglo-Boer War. These were performed at either the Grand Theatre or at open-air locations. A choir was also formed to take part in the official program of the unveiling ceremony. The inauguration day started with a service in the Twin Spiral Church in Bloemfontein. This service was supposed to be presented by the Reverend J.D. Kestel, well-known spiritual leader of the Boers during the war. After Kestel had welcomed another highly respected figure in church circles, the aged Dr. Andrew Murray at the local railway station, he decided on the spur of the moment to ask Murray to conduct the sermon. Murray obliged gladly, and in his sermon he emphasized that the inauguration day must be a festival of God's love. Thereafter, the churchgoers and dignitaries took part in a procession to the monument. From the Twin Spiral Church, they proceeded to Maitland Street. Then they turned into President Brand Street and followed Monument Road to their destination. Wagons with girls and spiders transporting dignitaries also took part in the procession. Music was provided by the Kimberley Volunteers, interestingly enough, an English unit. At the monument, about 20,000 people were waiting for the procession. After scripture reading and prayer, the choir performed a few spiritual songs. Then followed the speech of President Steyn, in which he identified that which kept the women going in those difficult times.
It was a firm belief that the Almighty determines the fate of nations. He who said, "I will never leave you." The descendants from such mothers do not have to fear the future. May this monument always remind us as a nation of the sacrifices made by those who love their fatherland so dearly.
Then Mrs. Steyn unveiled the group of statues and side panels. This was followed by numerous speeches and the laying of wreaths. After the official proceedings and until sunset that evening, thousands of locals and visitors approached the monument in rows to view the statues and side panels up close. In 1914, most members who served in the initial working committee to facilitate the erection of the memorial were also appointed as the first members of the National Women's Memorial Commission. Through the years, it has been the task of this commission to maintain, manage and secure the future of this memorial. Several individuals who had been closely involved in the Anglo-Boer War were also buried at the monument, namely President Steyn in 1916, General de Wet in 1922, the ashes of Emily Hobhouse in 1926, and Reverend Kestel in 1941. Towards the end of her life, Mrs. Steyn objected strongly to the possibility of being buried at the memorial.
When I've passed away, it will be a great pity if I'm buried with the President. I'm of the opinion that the Women's Memorial should not be turned into a graveyard. The reason being that too many graves may divert attention away from the real meaning of the monument. Therefore, I plead with the Monument Commission not to allow anyone to bury me on the site.
However, when Mrs. Steyn passed away in 1955, most Afrikaners insisted that she be buried with her husband at the monument in recognition of the invaluable role that she played in the history of the Afrikaner nation. Since its inception, almost 100 years ago, the monument has become a site of special significance to Afrikaners, not only to honor their women and children who died in the camps, but also to commemorate events related to the Anglo-Boer War and to celebrate the role that Emily Hobhouse had played in improving conditions in the camps. The War Museum of the Boer Republics was established adjacent to the Women's Memorial in 1931. Today, this museum, as one of the custodians of the heritage of the Anglo-Boer War, follows an inclusive approach focusing on the suffering of all communities during the war. We believe that both the War Museum and Women's Memorial firstly has had a role to play in reconciling Afrikaans and English South Africans.
One must clearly understand that there was no policy on the side of the British to kill Boer civilians, to let them die on purpose in the camps. The British did not come to South Africa to deal in the first instance with civilians, but to wage a war. Unfortunately, the consequence was a humanitarian disaster.
In the speech of President Steyn, we already see the token of reconciliation, talking about it as a symbol of remembrance, not of hatred, which was erected out of piety for the people who gave their lives. We want to reconcile with other people, but then as an Afrikaner nation, as a people in their own right, recognizing also the possibilities of other people to become their own in South Africa for all.
Secondly, by acknowledging the suffering of black people in the war, we at the museum also believe that the Women's Memorial and especially the War Museum have a significant message of reconciliation to share with all South Africans.
If the conditions were bad in the internment camps for the white civilians, the conditions in the black internment camps were much worse. More than one author has actually referred to criminal neglect in terms of the way in which the British military authorities dealt with the black civilians in the internment camps during the Anglo-Boer War.
The Women's Memorial was erected firstly to honor the Afrikaner women and children who died and suffered during the Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902. However, no recognition was given to the suffering of black women and children during that war. This memorial behind me serves as a token of reconciliation for what is displayed inside the museum, namely the suffering of the Afrikaner women and children, but then also the suffering of black women and children.
Yes, as we stand here next to the Women's Memorial, the message in there is not only of reconciliation, but it's also a message that says, as women, we must ensure that this kind of suffering of women and children never happens again. We have a responsibility as women because we bring up these children and they grow up to be adults who take arms and go to war against one another. So we have our responsibility is to make sure that the children we give birth to and bring up grow up understanding peace and also understanding the misery of the sufferings of war.
However, placing the role of the War Museum and Women's Memorial in a larger South African context today is not aiming at minimizing the experiences of the Afrikaner community during the war. Both these facilities will always have a special place in the hearts of many Afrikaners.
Dit bly altyd vir my lekker om hierheen te kom, want ek ervaar gebondenheid. En dan is dit vir my nodig dat ons nie net by die lyding sal stil staan nie, maar ook die opstaan van die mense daarna sal vashou. En dat ons sal put uit hulle moed en hulle daadkrag om hier dinge te maak werk in die nuwe Suid-Afrika. Om in te ploeg en aan te hou, sodat ons 'n wenner van ons land sal maak in die wêreld.
Remember, these dead women were not great as the world counts greatness. Some of them were quite poor women who had laboured much. Yet they have become a moral force in your land. They will enrich your history. We claim it a world monument, of which all the world's women should be proud. For your dead, by their brave simplicity, have spoken to universal womanhood.